I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to this panel debate on the topic Understanding and Addressing Inequality. The debate is organized by Bergen Summer Research School on Global Challenges. And for those of you who don't know what this summer school is actually about, I will give you a very brief introduction to it. I think many of you actually know, but I will be introducing it nevertheless. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Lise Rakner. I'm a professor at the Department of Health Promotion and Development at the University of Bergen, and I'm the scientific director of the Summer School 2022. So what is Bergen Summer Research School? It is a summer school arranged for PhD candidates from all over the world in June each year. It has been running since 2008, and before COVID, the summer school was a physical event. But since COVID struck, it has been run digitally. So also this year. And that is why you don't see many of our PhD students in the room. But we actually have more than 100 PhD candidates from 39 different countries taking the summer school this year. But they are all, of course, attending online. I hope you are here, out there. So the summer school is administered and led by the University of Bergen, but the courses offered come about as a joint venture between different learning and research institutions in Bergen. On board we have, in addition to the University of Bergen, Western Norwegian University of Applied Sciences, the Norwegian School of Economics, the Christian Michelsen's Institute, and NORS, a large private research institution. So the scientific director of the summer school, in cooperation with its academic board, decides a year in advance on the umbrella topic for next year's summer school. And for this year's summer school, which of course was planned last year, 2021, we landed on inequality as our overarching topic. We thought this to be appropriate, not only because inequality as it is at the heart of most global challenges we are facing today, but also due to the pandemic. COVID both displayed and aggravated existing inequalities and produced new forms of precarity across the globe. And here I should mention that because we chose inequality as a topic, we have also worked closely with GRIP, UIB's global research program on inequality. So, in planning the summer school, I invited scholars from different learning and research institutions, the ones I just mentioned, to prepare a PhD course related to their field of research. And there was a huge interest among people to take part. Almost everyone I contacted actually said yes. So this year we have had 6 parallel courses running with some 10 to 20 PhD candidates enrolled in each course. And we have had courses in inequality and governance, gender justice and the environmental crisis, economic experiments in developing countries, inequality in education and the arts, food security for 8 billion, and climate change and the inequality of mobility. So a range of interesting courses. And in addition, we have organized a cross-cutting course for all summer school participants called Systems Thinking, Creative Problem Solving and Project Management. And in this course, the PhD candidates have been working with problems related to child poverty. As you can hear, and we are now approaching the time of the debate. I'm sorry to take so long, but I will stop in a short while. So as you can hear, we have covered a wide range of topics and perspectives related to inequality. And the panel debate we have organized for you have participants from each of the 6 individual courses, representing an equally wide range of perspectives and disciplines. And now the panel members will very soon be introduced to you, but first I need to introduce the person who will chair the panel today, namely Carmelisa Rosario. Carmelisa has a background in social anthropology and the anthropology of development, and her research has focused on issues related to poverty, inequality, health, reproductive rights, and women's and vulnerable groups' rights. And as part of her postdoctoral research, did I forget to say that you are postdoctoral researcher at the CMI Institute? I think I forgot. Carmelisa is a postdoctoral researcher at the CMI Institute. And as part of her postdoctoral research, Carmelisa is looking into female traditional leadership structures in the context of the conflict-affected region of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. Additionally, she is leading a team that is assisting the municipality of Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, of course, in planning for a more gender-equal, inclusive, and safer city for women. And also, and this is my last sentence, she is part of a pan-African network of scholars researching and promoting gender-transformative social policies in Africa. Carmelisa, I now leave the floor to you and the panel participants.
Thank you, Lise. So what we are going to take advantage of having this wonderful panel is talking about inequality, as was said by Haldes, from a very broad perspective, from different disciplines, and trying to understand inequality, its causes and effects, the global and local processes generating and reproducing inequalities. And of course, we are in the middle of a pandemic, or we are still living the effects of the pandemic. It is still close in our memories, COVID, of course, but we also have a war raging on in many countries in the world. We have migration crises that are recurrent and increasing, climate issues. So there are many issues that we need to think about when we think about inequality, and it is great to see that from different perspectives and not just just from one perspective. We will also talk about how can we, from these perspectives, represent, address, and combat inequality, because understanding is one thing, but it's also good to address it and try to do something about it. And the overarching goal is to see if the different disciplines can actually speak to each other, contribute to each other, and sort of find a common goal towards which we then talk further about how to address inequality as multiple scholars. I will ask a question which I will address the panel, and ask each of you to answer this question from your own perspective and experience and discipline. And I will introduce you when you're supposed to talk. So my first question is, learning about inequality from different research and disciplinary perspectives. From your research field, how do you understand inequality, its causes and effects, and the processes generating and reproducing inequality? Lise Rakner, I will ask you first, but before that, I will introduce you with a few words. Lise Rakner is a professor in political science at the University of Bergen and a researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. Her research interest covers a broad field of research, from democratization, with a focus on democratic backlash, human rights, party systems and elections, economic reform, taxation, to institutional change and international aid. Lisa, please.
Thank you so much, Carmelisa, and thank you for a very kind introduction. So the question that I was posed was, how do you understand inequality from your discipline? And so, since so much of my work throughout my life has been interdisciplinary, that was a little bit of a challenge. So right now, I'm just going to be a political scientist. So I'm going to see this as through the lens of political science. And so, for a political scientist, not surprisingly, we see politics as the heart of it. And we do see economic inequality understood as, unequal access to resources as closely interlinked to political inequality. And political inequality is actually unequal access to political resources. And that could be issues like, access to decision makers, a place at the table where decisions are made, power, a place to and space to organize. Basically, political power to affect your own and your group's economic and political interests. So for us, these two issues are closely interlinked. And so in this course, we've really been battling with these issues. So are there some political regime forms that are better at addressing inequality? Are democracies always better at addressing inequalities, for instance, than autocracies? Well, even if we agree on that and the long historical data supports that, why would not democracies, where people have full access to, to information, full access to the right to vote, ability to organize and protest and form trade unions, if that's a democracy, why are democracies unequal? That has been sort of at the heart of the questions that we've been addressed. Why are democratic regimes not able to address inequalities? That has been a huge part of our discussion. I think the best way to describe how political scientists look at interconnections between political and economic inequality is a graph. And in a normal world, like in a classroom, I would show you a PowerPoint. But just visualize it. Here's a graph, and it goes like this. And so on the one side, you have an axis going up, that is inequality. And inequality then measured in an expanded Gini coefficient, so expanded difference between people in inequality. And then on the other hand, you have a graph going that way. So they cross. There's like a cross. And that is trade union membership. So at the first, so there's very low trade union membership, and there is high inequality. Come the Second World War, you see a period after the Second World War, you see an increasing number of people being unionized, and you see a decreasing level of inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. This changes, and they take a different direction in the 1980s. 1980 is a critical juncture in my graph. And I'm not talking about OECD countries. So, because those are the countries where it's actually, it's difficult to get good data on this. So, trade union membership and so forth. Anyway, so 1980s, shoulder pads, bad music, lots of crazy stuff. But it was also a time of real regulation, of deregulation, where, trade union membership, businesses became very deregulated, and especially in the UK under Margaret Thatcher and in the US. But this is a trend that has really just continued. I'm going to stop there. I think I'm doing okay on time, but just visualize this graph and think about this is the most kind of easily visualized way of how political and economic inequality hangs together for a political scientist.
Thank you, Lise. That was I'm seeing the graph, and I won't forget it. And it's a very good way of explaining. And you are almost on time, but it was too interesting to stop you. But now I give you the word, Kjetil. And Kjetil is a professor of economics, and I think you will continue on, I guess, from where Lise left, at NHH, and member of the research group FAIR, a center of excellence for research on inequality. He has conducted several field experiments on entrepreneurship and education in East Africa, with a particular focus on promoting gender equality and skills development among youth. Besides being a prolific author of academic articles, he has also written Microéconomie and ABC pour 1, 2, 3, Microeconomics and ABC in 1, 2, 3, a novel and refreshing foundational textbook in economics. Your take on inequality.
Thank you, and I will definitely pick up on Lise's excellent little introduction here on the importance of institutions, which clearly are key to understanding the sources of inequality and what can be done about it. But let me first also pick up on the measurement of inequality. I'll take the economics perspective and talk about income inequality. And you mentioned the Gini coefficient. There are different ways of measuring inequality, the distance between the top and the bottom earners and so on. So there are different measures, and that's like a science in itself, how to measure inequality. But irrespective of how you measure it, and I'll not go into details there, there are strong views about inequality, how inequality has developed. And some people claim inequality in the world has gone up, some claim it's gone down, and actually they're both right in some sense. It depends on the perspective. So if you look at it from a country perspective, inequality in the world has actually gone down in the last decades. Whereas if you look at inequality from the within-country perspective, inequality has gone up. Take China as a driving force of these tendencies. So China, a poor country, when the reform started in the late 1970s, poor country in the international context, it's grown by like 10% GDP growth every year. So lifting millions of people out of poverty in China, and then by the fact that China has 1.3 billion people, reducing global inequality, taking China from a low-income country to a middle-income country. That's reduced global inequality. But clearly, growth in China has not been equal. Some parts of China have grown faster than others, so the coastal cities and so on have been grown extremely fast. So increasing inequality within China. So you have increased inequality within China, but then the fact that China has grown as a country has reduced global inequality. Mm-hmm. Good news is on the reduction in poverty in China is that if you look at poverty, not that maybe we should be more concerned about poverty rather than inequality, because increases in inequality can arise from different sources. So in China, for instance, inequality has gone up, but clearly poverty has gone down. And poverty has, in fact, gone down throughout the whole world. So extreme poverty has gone down radically in the last decades. It's more and more an African phenomenon, unfortunately. So it's concentrated in Africa, but poverty counts has gone down in the world, which is very, very good news. What are the causes of the increase in inequality that we see within countries? That's also a very, very complex question. Economists, there's a famous Kuznets kind of curve, like a bell-shaped curve theory that increase. But just imagine that in inequality, according to this theory, which is also contested, but inequality will rise in the process of economic development. Again, take China as an example, with abundant access to human capital, to labor. With investments coming into the country, some people will get rich. Labor costs are held down because of this abundance of labor, so wages are held down. At some point, there's a shortage of labor as investments keep on pushing demand for labor up. So at that point, sort of inequality will go down. That sort of explains the Kuznets curve. So that's seeing inequality, the dynamics of inequality as a natural part of the growth process. Another perspective on the increase in inequality, let's see what we see in the United States is it due to labor-saving technological progress, the robots and automatization of production, or is it due to globalization, with China competing against manufacturing in the U.S., keeping wages low? So these are again very important drivers of the inequality increase that we see in a country like the United States. Which of these two, technological progress or like robots versus, is it robots or China? Basically, the jury is still out, but these are important driving forces for understanding the causes of inequality. Very shortly, what are the effects of inequality?
Very shortly.
Very shortly, yeah. Again, I think inequality can be a source of many, many problems, social tensions, and so on. But I think it's also important, I would like to make that as my final point, that inequality as such is not necessarily a problem. If some types of inequality can be seen as unproblematic and fair, indeed, if inequality is the result of hard work, Lise works much harder than I do. She publishes more than myself because I'm lazy. That inequality is not unjust, it's fair. So if inequality is or is perceived as due to hard work rather than luck, it's probably less problematic than inequality which is due to luck. United States versus Europe, for instance, inequality in the United States perceived as much more fair and less problematic than in Europe, because people in America think that inequality is due to, the American dream, work hard and you will succeed. In Europe, maybe for historical reasons, due to kingdoms, aristocracy, and so on. Good luck. So anyway, I'll stop there, but it's complex.
Yeah, but the conversation will continue. And here, I was supposed to give you the word, René, but actually I would like to know if any of you has strong comments to what has been said so far, and would like to say something either in strong agreement, but I would rather hear about strong disagreements. I'm particularly actually interested in this issue. Is inequality inevitable? Is it something that we have to expect about this issue of growth? There have been discussions, for example, regarding should we grow, should growth be the objective, for example? This would be something that would be in my mind after hearing you, at least. I don't want to monopolize.
I had a thought that might spill into what I was going to, just listening to the word inequality over and over again, and then thinking about, and this is, I'm the Canadian on the panel. I don't know if you know that that's required for all panels to have a Canadian, but I'm the one they chose. You are? We'll get a little bonus for that. Yeah, that's great. And so I don't know if this is like controversial to say, but I'm not sure. So as a sort of feminist philosopher, I'm interested in what creates a desire for a vibrant and flourishing planet. I'm not sure the word inequality captures, like is the most desiring word. Do you know, I don't know, maybe that other people will sort of step in, but it's such a, you did such a lovely job of explaining sort of that it's data and measurement, and of course it is that, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be that, but I'm just compelled by when I talk to my students and I present to them the data on inequality, I don't always feel that that is what will motivate them to change. And so then I just wonder whether or not there are other words. It's not that we don't use inequality, but that there's something about that term itself. And again, I'm going out on a limb here, so please, you're welcome to just say, this is, no, inequality is our word, and it's good, and it captures everything. But that, yeah, there's something kind of cold about that way of describing what it means for us to think about the state of all beings, human and otherwise, in the world, and the kind of lives that they're living, and how we can improve those lives.
Well, do you want to? Yes.
So I had a thought while you were talking to your talk about economic inequality, and you said it kind of in passing, but of course this is something that we have to talk about, because people think that inequality describes already something as a problem, but that's not the case, right? As you said, some inequalities are totally justified. If somebody works hard and they earn more money because they work 80 hours per week and not 40 hours per week, that's an inequality, but it's totally justified, right? So when we talk about inequality, we obviously have a very specific idea of what's at stake or what's the problem here, right? And so in that respect, I think we need to be careful of using the term in a contextual and also in a kind of systematic way. So I'm a philosopher. Sorry, I should out myself right away.
I will out you soon.
And so it doesn't help us to just say that's when you have two people and they something happens between them. They don't say that's unequal. They say that's unfair, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're really concerned about is an inequality that is unfair. And then we have to talk about when is an equality unfair, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's maybe the takeaway from these two first presentations. So if there's a political inequality, that's unfair because in the political realm, everybody should be equal. But it's not unfair if there are economic inequalities, if they can be justified.
Well, René, now it's your turn. René Valiquette is a professor in Nipissing, University in Northern Canada, in the departments of Gender, Equality and Social Justice, Child and Family Studies, and Critical Interdisciplinary Studies. It's a mouthful. Blah, blah.
Yep.
Her research expands feminist philosophical contributions to contemporary environmental ethics. I think we saw a little bit of that in there. In recent years, her work has broadened into an assessment of university infrastructures and the untapped potential of university classrooms to help remake the world. Wow. Please.
Okay, so normally, as I'm sure we all have, normally I have classes that are 3 hours, and I find that limiting. So 3 minutes was like a kind of fun task to fathom, so I really tried to distill. So here's my distillation. When I'm explaining inequality, I would say from my discipline, which as you see is really not a discipline, it's interdisciplinary, that inequality is real, which seems obvious, but in fact, in some ways, I do have to do the work with my students to say to them, inequality is real. There are moments where I think they have this perception that it doesn't exist, and certainly not in the next ones. So inequality is real, it is endemic, it is unjust, right? So the kind of inequality we're interested in, you helped clarify that for me, the kinds of inequality we're interested in are the unjust ones. And solvable. So that's my distillation. Real, endemic. What was my third one?
Unjust.
Unjust, thank you. This is an occupational hazard. I'm used to having a room full of people that listen to me, and then I constantly, when I'm teaching, say, what was I saying? And it's very hard when I'm outside that context. And solvable. And in terms of what drives or continues or perpetuates unjust inequalities, I would say that we don't have good enough infrastructures of desire. So from a feminist philosopher perspective, working in the areas of environmental humanities, and my own area, the theoretical core of it is feminist immanence. And how I read what immanence means is an understanding that life is embedded. We are all embedded in environments with humans and many other actors, human and non-human. We are embodied, which we understand in feminist theory to mean that your perspective is always within a position that can never be a full, totalized perspective. We are entangled in each other's, in the lives of others, in debts and implicated and complicated and complicit ways. We are in these networks. So in other words, we are not free agents that can just say, I think this is wrong, I will fix it. We are always in these kind of webs of relations that give us some opportunities to move and some others. And of course, there are great differences in where you stand in terms of what kinds of possibilities you have. And so I think that I will say more about this for the second question, but I think that when you understand life in that way, then you recognize that if we want to think about what perpetuates inequality now, given that we live at a very different historical moment with phenomenal access, especially in the privileged world, to information, you can easily find out about how deeply unjust the inequalities in the world are. But then, and you can imagine that for somebody interested in the environment, we are obsessed with what stops us from from moving from knowing to doing something, right? We have access to knowing, but we don't seem to move as fast or as urgently or as dramatically as we need to. What stops that? And so that brings me back to the idea of desire. From a feminist perspective, we think about, again, this embedded, a new word, embedded, embodied, entangled world. And so I think that we are mistaken, as I was saying before, when we think that the way to address inequality is to tell people what they ought to do. I don't think oughts are that motivating. I think we need to tell them how to desire otherwise.
Thank you, René. That is very inspiring. I will move on to Anne-Birgitte Milford, who is also an economist. You have written your PhD about fair trade and organic coffee cooperatives in Mexico. She has later worked as a researcher for the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research in Bergen. Her research has been focused on environmental production methods such as organic and pesticide-reduced alternative local sales channels for agricultural products and climate-friendly diets. I think we kind of still touching upon fairness and upon climate, but you're also an economist, so maybe you can speak to everyone else who has come before you.
Thank you so much. So this was a very interesting task. I have never done any research on inequality in my life, and neither theoretically or empirically, except the fair trade bit that I will come back to. So I thought, what could I speak about today? I've been teaching in the course Food Security for 8 billion, and so I thought I should talk about food production, and the farmers was just a group that struck me, that the situation of the farmers today as a group who is economically under pressure in large parts of the world, including in Norway. So lately I've been working mainly with Norway, so I'm going to start with that. There's been a debate lately about the inequality of Norwegian farmers. And Norwegian farmers are, of course, super wealthy if you compare them to farmers in the south, but they still have a much lower income than the average Norwegian income, and which means that they very often cannot afford to pay for the things that the other Norwegians can. And this is especially the case for the small-scale farmers. And it's just getting more and more difficult to be a small-scale farmer. It's this tendency of merging that we've seen also in the agri-industry and sort of also at later on in the supply chain, but it's also going on at the farm scale. So the large farmers are the ones that are surviving. The small ones have to stop and sell their farm. Sometimes in Norway, they are lucky enough that they can have another job in addition to the farm. That's a possibility. And they are the better off. If you try to live off only a small-scale farm, you will definitely never, you will always be far below the average income. So this is something that it can be explained by basically competition and the fact that there will always be someone who is more efficient, a farm which is more efficient than the other because of economies of scale, and they're able to offer food that is cheaper than what other farmers can, and so they're outcompeted because they're not able to sell at the lowest price that can only be offered by the large-scale farmer. So this is also, in a way, the same situation in a global scale. The poor countries are also not able to compete with the large farmers in the rich countries with their products. So they are ending up selling only a few products that they may sell, which are the tropical ones, coffee, bananas, and so on. Again, creating very low prices for these products. And and they are also sometimes not able to produce even flour and things like that because it's being sold to them from the rich countries at a lower price. So, so this is why farmers are poor. That's the explanation for that in general, small-scale farmers. I also want to add to that there is also, it's not so simple to say that this is only bad, because of course low food prices is a benefit for those who are poor who are not farmers. So it's also in a way a factor that is reducing inequality, that the poor people living in and working in cities are benefiting from this sort of competition driving farmers poor, yes. This was just a very different perspective from everyone else, but
not completely different. We're still talking
still
about this
yes.
something that can be seen as bad and also as good. You know, bad things can also generate good things. I have often thought about, for example, this coming from Mozambique. I'm originally from Mozambique. There is inequality, economic inequality, which is I do not consider a good thing, economic inequality, because it generates insecurity, for example. And I think that can have, for example, an impact on climate. And how so? For example, I need to drive because there are no public transports that I can use. As a middle-class person, I need to drive. I will hold my windows closed so that I won't be hijacked or robbed, and I will have my air conditioner on. And that is really bad for the environment. And so this inequality that creates insecurity has all these rippling effects of inequality. So there are these dimensions of fairness, unfairness, and how people, in your case, farmers, live the inequalities in their lives are very important to sort of dive in and see, as an anthropologist, you know, from a perspective, the individual or the micro perspective, to really understand the driver. So thank you for your inputs. And I will pass on to you, Ellen. Ellen Eidsvik is a geographer and a musician, and many other things, a cyclist and other these things. And a professor in climate and sustainability education at HVL, Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. He's also professor in geography at the Department of Teacher Education at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. Your take.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for all the exciting input. This was I've learned a lot. I tried to connect some of my points, because I was initially thinking of speaking from a geographer's point of view, right? Inequalities of geography, exclusion from certain arenas, in place, out of place, and all these things. But I'm also a teacher educator, and now during the course we've had, which is inequality in higher education and the arts, we have been discussing education, higher education, but also education, and the sort of terms of knowledge and discerning knowledge to students and to learners out there. So I think I'd rather speak of education. And first of all, education, there's a consensus, we all agree that is a sort of a basic the condition for human development, societal progress, and so on. But it is also, there are some problematic aspects of education today globally. It creates and reconfirms inequalities. It does so by different mechanisms, through commodification, through certain hegemonic knowledge systems, and through a competitive system with emphasis of assessment and so on, and also which is very much connected to the neoliberal governance of the 80s, as Lise mentioned, where we're sort of inequalities with the axis crossed. So, and we see a sort of an increasing this push towards globalization of education, the push towards a standardization. And we see that it fails to, in many contexts, to develop the child, the student, the human. And why? Well, the knowledge then discerned from the curriculum, from the different curriculum around the world, through teachers, educators to the learners, does not necessarily resonate with the learners, with their world, with their culture, with the context of the learners. And that is also where sort of the necessity of critical pedagogy perspectives is very fruitful. So we know that education, it takes place within the framework of the state, right? That's where it's regulated. But it's also what you can call a policy-scape of education, where the the framework of education is governed or formulated or created at the international level, and then also adjusted at the state level, and then implemented at the local level. So here comes the geography with the scale perspective as well. So the sort of the international level has an enormous impetus in how the child there in different contexts around the world. And this is highly sort of this is problematic, and one of sort of the main arguments is that because it creates an exclusion and inequality. It creates sort of distance in terms of access is one thing, commodification of education, but also in terms of what kind of knowledge that is that is presented for the learners around the world. So in general, and we've spent quite a lot of time during the course in discussing these issues, where we see that the urge for a more sort of inclusive curriculum, which is more adapted to local contexts. And I'll come back to that when we have more than 3 minutes. So I'll leave that for that. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm going to give you all more than 3 minutes, because I have been very generous now. So before I go to you, Christine, because I think that you will do a wonderful job as a philosopher of sort of distilling the thought processes behind all these disciplines. I have here a comment from the participants online that I think would be interesting, because we have been talking about this unjust inequality, and the question is, would perhaps inequity be a better word to discuss when talking about unjust inequality? And I would give the word to you. Let me present you, just so that you take it from here, and then I will give the opportunity to everyone else. So, Christine Strelle, is a professor of practical philosophy at the University of Hamburg. Her work is an intersection of moral and political philosophy and public policy, which means making normative recommendations on how to design just public policies. She has many accolades, has authored numerous articles, several edited collections, including The Political Philosophy of Refuge from Cambridge University Press, and Vulnerability, Autonomy, and Applied Ethics from Routledge. And her upcoming publications include Debating the Surrogacy from Oxford University Press, and your monography on vulnerability, territory, and migration.
Thank you very much. So I want to take you a step back before we can actually address the question of whether or not we should talk about equity rather than equality. So I've gotten these questions, and I thought that's a really interesting question, right? So why do we care about inequality? So why do we care about inequality? As a philosopher, as you've heard, we think that we're all moral equals, right? So we assume that there's no reason why some person should be treated differently than another on moral grounds, right? We all have the same status. We don't believe in nobility anymore. Forget the queen and her platinum jubilee. Of course, you have a king in Norway. But even the king in Norway is kind of treated as an equal, right? So the idea here is that as human beings, we should all be treated as moral equals. We have the same moral status. And then, of course, the question is, well, how do we translate that idea, right? So how do we translate that premise into action? And some people think, well, it means that we have to actually treat people equally, right? And so I think this came out in some of the things that you said about political rights and economic rights. The idea is, well, if we don't treat people equally, then we are doing an unfairness, then we are committing harm. And some people think, no, actually, it's not a question of treatment, it's a question of consideration. People should be equally considered morally, right? And consideration is, of course, a bit less demanding than equal treatment. Okay, so but either way, we have to kind of think about how we translate that promise of moral equality into actually action. And some of the speakers have already talked about this. So in democratic societies, we translate this by giving people rights, and we give people equal rights, right? So non-citizens don't have citizenship rights, but citizens have equal rights in terms of social, political, civic rights, how you want to call them, right? And this is very important. So equal rights are the kind of expression of our belief in moral equality. And of course, inequality starts, and this goes back to what you were all saying, education, farming, and so on and so forth. Inequality starts when our rights don't actually give us equal access to things, right? So this is the thing. So I was having an interesting conversation with some Norwegians who said, well, you know, of course, in Norway, everybody has the right to education. I'm sitting next to an educator. Happens. But if we have private schools who provide so much better education than public schools, then my right to education doesn't allow me to actually realize my moral equality, right? Instead, there's some kind of inequality created if there's a two-tier system. Same thing, I understand, in Norway is an interesting discussion going on about healthcare and whether or not private healthcare should be more expanded and so on and so forth. Same idea, right? We have right to healthcare as part of civic right in Norway, but if there are two-tiered systems, then some people get a different kind of healthcare than others. And that's where we realize that inequality actually is tied to people not being able to realize their rights. Okay, last bit. How do we think about it on a global level? So on the global level, of course, you understand from all the discussions we've had so far that there are huge inequalities. And we'll talk about this in the second question. But I want to suggest that there is some kind of agreement. And this agreement is a very minimal one, I acknowledge that. But it is the agreement that we found, which is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So the human rights that we all take for granted are meant to assure that people have the basic minimum. And this kind of basic minimum is meant to express equal moral standing as human beings, right? And then in the second part, I'll talk more about how that is a problem because they're not realized. So now let's talk about this question. Is it better to talk about inequity rather than inequality? Well, yes, in some contexts, I think that's right? So for example, in the economic context or in the education context, inequity sounds to me as though it's about a bundle of goods. And then that bundle of goods is distributed unfairly. There's an inequity. But I think inequality has an appeal, and we shouldn't throw it out the window just yet. Because I think that there's an important thing. It's a different moral value if you talk about equality than if you talk about equity, it seems to me. Because equity is always relative, right? Equity is always comparative. But the moral status that people are owed is an absolute. And this is exactly why the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is so important, because that defines the absolute minimum, right? It doesn't help me if somebody compares my bundle to your bundle. I still need to have the absolute minimum protected. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Does anyone want to follow this or comment? This and the rest of the presentations that haven't been commented by the other panelists. I think it was brilliantly explained. Of course, the philosopher had to explain why we think the way we do.
That's what they pay me for.
I think we, on the education part, I think we can agree on the moral justification for giving all children the right to a basic high-quality education. You know, depriving some kids from high-quality education does not give, that's inequality of opportunity. Of course, then they can use those education, you know, according to their own wishes. They can be lazy or hardworking. That can create more justified inequalities. But at least giving children a basic education, I think, is fundamental. And I'd be happy to talk more about it now, because it's an educational crisis, of course, in Africa, which is extremely disturbing, creating inequality and poverty. So it is a lot of interesting research. I've done some research myself on that, so I'll be happy to talk about that when that time comes. But I think education is key for economic development, key for combating unjust inequality.
Lisa, you
I
raised your hand.
don't know if I'm taking up my time or what I'm doing now, but I thought maybe I'll kind of put some heat into this. So what I'm a little bit nervous when we relativize, inequality. So, maybe it's, what is okay? And I do realize there's a lot of research, on this, what we accept of what is unfair, what is luck, what is, but I want to take you in a different direction. I want to say, okay, if I'm right as a political, if the political scientist is right, so if it's political inequality that drives economic inequality, if it is because I as a rich person, or I as a kind of a Donald Trump person, can buy my way into power, can buy, I have all the money in the world to buy myself political. So when everyone knows that the only people who should not have tax exemptions are the only ones that gets it. Now, that is that's when political inequality, access to power, drives economic inequality. So, I know you follow me. This is an easy one. But, okay, follow me one more step. Follow me to the global level. So, isn't this exactly what is going on in the world today? Isn't the problem we're facing, back to the brilliant first keynote address, isn't this exactly what is happening? That the political power globally is so skewed that, we are, the global institutions, the global economic institutions, the global political institutions, they're totally skewed towards the haves. And in this case, that's us. So my point is, maybe, this is what I'm getting out of this, maybe you should listen more to political scientists. Maybe we should talk much more about how access to political power is really what's driving it. And then we can have those small, petty discussions about, how should we measure this, and how should we? Yeah, I'm doing this. I'm trying to heat up the discussion on purpose. But my point is, maybe it is this access to power, access to political resources at a global level. And at a national level, that's what we really should be talking about. So that was my 2 cents for yay for political scientists.
Yes, Christine.
Yay for political science, I agree, of course. But I think that there are some countries where you can observe that they have a kind of power. They don't have necessarily political, or let me put it differently. Take Nigeria, right? Oil resource rich, is coveted by many international firms to let them exploit the oil. They have no standing in the international community. They are exploited. There's an elite that gains the exploitation rights, or the exploitation resources, the revenue. And so to what extent would it help us if we said, oh, well, Nigeria, if it were a democratic country, then we could have a different conversation? Or to what extent would it make a difference if now the government of Nigeria would have a different standing in the international community? So if you're talking about political power, it obviously has to deal with to what extent do we think of political power as necessarily democratic? And to what extent do we think of political power as actually satisfying the needs of people on the ground, right?
Okay, those are these are actually points that I put in that 3-minute thing that you promised us.
Yes. So there is a second part, as everyone has been mentioning, and thinking, okay, now we will have now we will have time to. We are moving now on to what to do about inequality. So we were talking about how to think about inequality, the different ways we can think about inequality, and I have had several comments here. I have the comments about a comment about how can the systems that benefit from inequality be inhibited. I have a comment on the main global inequalities, only a few people holding more than 90% of wealth in the world. So is education creating inequality or helping reducing it? These are things sort of that are about what can we do about it. And I've been hearing, for example, you said that poverty is an African phenomenon. You talked about you talked about the educational crisis in Africa, so you're focused on Africa. But yes, on measurement levels, yeah, Africa has been at the bottom. So can countries, developing countries, and Africa in particular, that seems to be lagging behind, according to the measurements, catch up? Should we measure differently? What can we do about inequality? Is it about changing measurement? So I will start here now.
So I think this is a really interesting question. Obviously, I think that. But I think what we've been doing, and Lisa may have prompted this, is that we're thinking about inequality in terms of distributive inequality, right? And Lisa says, well, it's also about inequality in power. And I want to make a very maybe lame suggestion, because I think that there's something that we should equalize, which is much more basic, but which is, in my view, the most fundamental inequality. And then we can talk about to what extent you disagree or disagree. So I've talked about global inequality in the sense that I said in my first comment that we realize normally equality through at least the instrument of human rights, right? And so I think what we know about human rights is, of course, that more and more the international community has accepted a certain kind of responsibility for the human rights of everybody. So people who live in states in which their human rights are not protected, either because their state can't protect them or won't protect them, the international community has accepted that we have a responsibility to do that, right? So I think that, so then we can talk about whether or not, having access to resources, to the basic needs of having a worthwhile life counts as a human right. But I want to give you two examples of how I see a fundamental inequality, and we don't necessarily think about it in those terms, but maybe after my remaining 3.5 minutes, you do. So take the standard case of refugees, right? According to the Geneva Convention, individuals are supposed to be able to find asylum and refuge if they are persecuted in their home countries, right? So if their human rights are not protected by their country of origin, or if their country of origin can't protect their human rights, then the idea is that refugees should go to another country and be able to find refuge. And so the idea is precisely what I said, that the idea that other countries are called upon to protect human rights of those whose country isn't doing that. But of course now what we see is actually a system of refugeehood that is extremely multi-tiered, right? You have people who arrive in the camps. If they're lucky, they get picked up by Canada, because Canada delegates the responsibility for refugee designation to the UNHCR. Then you have people who try to get to Europe. If they're unlucky, they drown in the Mediterranean. You have people who are now being sent back to Rwanda if they've made it to the UK. But you also have people who come from the Ukraine, who are obviously refugees in the traditional sense of the term, who are welcomed with open arms, right? So this is a kind of inequality nobody ever thinks about, because everybody thinks, well, refugees are all in the same category, and I understand that this is a highly controversial issue. But I just want to highlight that before saying, okay, let's just try to realize equality in terms of redistribution, let's be a bit more modest and try to realize some kind of equality, at least in treating people as equals. I'll give you another example, climate change. So my course was climate change and inequality in mobility. And of course, you figured that already. And Africa has a problem in terms of education, but when we talk about climate change, it's the global south more broadly, but not necessarily Africa. It's sub-Saharan Africa, right? So we know that climate change is a problem of the global south. Sub-Saharan Africa, South and East Asia, and the Pacific region house 83% of the people who are most affected by climate disasters. 83%, right? And incidentally, these are also the countries that are most challenged to protect their citizens against the disaster or against climate change, right? So how do we need to think about that in terms of institutional, global institutions? I think it's obvious that both the refugee crisis and the climate change crisis needs an institutional global response, right? But the institutions on the global level, of course, are always belittled, and everybody says, well, the UN is not really pulling its weight, etc. We have had accounts about how bad the effects of some global institutions have been. The IMF going into countries and saying, okay, well, we have to change your economic system because otherwise you won't get grants. But I think what we need to do is that in terms of inequality, we really need to push for international institutions in order to address these problems, because otherwise we're all going to be sunk, right? So right now we're still able to delegate those problems, but ultimately we're all going to be sunk if we're not going to be able to create institutions that actually have some teeth.
Thank you. You're so good with time. Ellen, please.
What a nice cue on international institutions. I'll continue from there. So what I tried to say some minutes ago was that at some levels education creates or reconfirms elitism, right? It makes some of us very privileged, and here we are, a very group of privileged people talking about inequality. So it's a kind of a process I found. And yes, of course, we should listen to the political scientists, and we should listen to the economists, because inequality is such a huge issue. We haven't even talked about taxation, for example, properly. So many and involving philosophical issues, feminism, everything. But if I take on the account of education again, because it really has to do with the upbringing of the mind and of the human being. And I mentioned policy-scape, that is sort of the educational policies is sort of formed internationally. And now we come to the international institutions, because the two major international bodies that it has molded education internationally is one, UNESCO, and secondly OECD. Like OECD, if you look into I've done research on the Norwegian curriculum, and if we look into the Norwegian and the European curricula, they are more or less blueprints of the OECD educational advices. It's very, very sort of much in line with it. They have a huge influence on educational policies worldwide. So OECD has formulated the skills for the 21st centuries and so on, and which is very much based on the Homo economicus, right? Which is fine. It's an organization for economic cooperation and development. So there we are. But now there's a shift in OECD. There's a shift in UNESCO in terms of how the language of education. We see that now in for example, the UNESCO, the pathways to 2050, which is a sort of global citizenship panel. The language has now changed. The higher education should be available at all, more driven by social justice, environmental justice, and inclusion with quality, as you also mentioned, the sort of access, but also with quality. And for example, highlighting such statements that we do not need more skills in the future, but more critical thinking, more empathy, more values-oriented action. So there's a change. And now, even in the UNESCO documents, we see the phrasing of the pluriverse, which is coined by post-colonial thinkers like, I think it was Escobar, and also been very much used by Quijano and Bembe and other and decolonial thinkers in establishing sort of plural knowledges, not only sort of the universe or the single Western concept of science. So now it is infused in UNESCO documents. OECD, even the 2030 agenda, is very much sort of inspired by the SDGs, and they have sort of addressed these major challenges major societal challenges that education need to address, and that is environment, climate, it is economic institutions in terms of creating new institutions or or economic understandings in facing challenges connected to artificial intelligence, robotization, and so on, and also the grand societal challenges connected to inequality and migration, for example. So and that is very much sort of in line with the SDG agenda. So there's really sort of the top level, the institutional level, is changing in how education has been phrased. So now if we now apply this term of policyscape, where we see these international bodies are very influential in how the different states then adjust and adopt education, then hopefully we will see change, and we will see a sort of an accept for different kind of knowledges, or even futures, as UNESCO has coined it now. So which means a sort of a broader understanding of knowledge, which again resonates with the kids, the students in the different regional contexts, in an African country, in an Asian country, in a Latin American country, in a European country, and so on. So towards less standardized and more inclusive education. So I think there is a progress and a process there.
Okay, hopeful thinking. We are becoming a little bit challenged for time, and I want to make sure that everyone gets the chance to get to the second question, but I also include some of the comments. So I will just sip in one comment and then give you the word, and hopefully you can answer, or someone else can then raise their hand and say something. So one of the comments is, and I think it goes a little bit on this, who bears the brunt of inequality, but who then benefits from inequality. There has been this lingering issue, even though it hasn't been mentioned as such. And so one of the comments is, the economic growth of many developing countries is always along with heavy pollution. Is it possible to balance economic growth and pollution? So this is on, how can things practically be done? And another comment is more on the historical side, so the origins of inequality. Can we go back to the long roots of inequality globally created by slavery, trade, war strategies? So I'm not saying that you have thought about this in your second answer, but if not, I'm sure other people can comment on that.
Yeah, well, I can try on the economic growth without pollution question, which is something I'm thinking about often. There used to be this term called green growth, which I think means that you can have growth in certain types of economic activities that are not polluting. So that would be production, of course, but also restaurants, hotels, so tourism without the traveling, so that you're just sort of being a tourist in your own town, going out to eat very often, things like that. That would create employment. Going to the hairdresser a lot would also create employment, but without having any pollution. And I think we can think about any kind of cultural activities, that we go more often to theaters, and these types of activities will create employment, growth, everything that we want from economic growth, but it will not have the additional pollution. So I also think that if we were just willing to pay more taxes, there are so many nice things that we could finance, and so many nice jobs that we could create. But for some reason, we want to keep our money for ourselves. And in Norway, we're particularly concerned with refurbishing our houses. So we spend billions on refurbishing our houses, and we're really unwilling to pay our taxes, so that there could be like more teachers in the schools, better hospitals, more doctors, and everything that we actually also are needing. So I think it's absolutely possible, but we just need to want to do it, as it is with many good things in the world. So yes. I also, when I was asked the questions, how do you address inequality, I just thought about very simple things like, we should tax the rich and maybe not pay such high wages to CEOs. So I had very sort of basic, simple solutions to that. I hope that the other economists will come up with something more elaborate. But what I wanted to say, something, I wanted just to talk about something else, which is not a solution to global inequality or any kind of inequality, but it's one tiny but very important opportunity that everyone, at least in Norway and many other countries, have, and that is to support ethically labeled, certified producers. So that's what I wrote my PhD thesis about with Kjetil, actually, as my supervisor. I'm still a big fan of fair trade labeled products. I was in Mexico studying coffee cooperatives for about a year, and these producers, they're small-scale farmers. They're extremely poor, and through being labeled certified, they can have the opportunity to receive a better price for the coffee that they produce, especially in the years when the coffee prices are very low. This is a really great opportunity for them. It could make the difference between not or being able to send their children to secondary school, for instance. So it could also potentially have long-term impacts. And of course, there are many limitations to this. It's only something that you can do for tropical products, and it's only still not, I think they have footballs now that you can buy fair trade footballs, but it's still something that's not really a solution that's making a difference from developing out of inequality or not. But it's something that I think that it's an easy way for any consumer to combat inequality, if only a tiny bit every time that you buy coffee or tea and any of those products that you normally do. I guess I'm out of time. Yeah, that's good, that's fine.
Can you
Next.
say it in 30 seconds?
Yes, I just wanted to say that also access to food is a very important factor which can be destroyed by the inequality that creates poverty. So I think that this is, I'm struggling a little bit to follow the discussion here, but to be honest, but to me I think that there is inequality, that the type of inequality that we have in Norway, which is kind of, yeah, it's inequality, but it's maybe not, it's not killing anyone, but the kind of inequality that is actually making people unable to eat what they need is something that's really important to address, and especially in the situation that we are today, with the crisis just increasing, and it will not go away with the climate change, everything that's going to happen in the future. This is really something this is the ball that we need to keep our eyes on, I think, the access to food for everyone. Yeah.
René.
First of all, I would just like to say that I blame Scandinavian design for a lot of this over-renovation of houses. So since I'm here, I would like to... but I'm going to pick up on your point about just a beautifully simple idea of paying more taxes, and come back to so what I think is the key to the solution. I'm going to also take a seat on the train of education. When I listen to these sort of comments about how, it's about the moral standing of the individual that we extend, or that it's political access to political power, unequal access to political power. I'm going to give you a sense of sort of the kind of work I do, and maybe you'll have a sense of how it connects. So in the simplest answer, I would say that we need to take teaching at universities more seriously. We need to have it at least at equal standing with how we treat research. So that's my sort of attempt to distill, again, the call to distill. And I think that we underestimate the power of teaching. I think it's even odd that we separate research and teaching, as though good research doesn't come from amazing learning experiences. We have a system that doesn't reward professors for caring about teaching. So why do I think we should care about teaching? So I teach at a very small university, Northern Canada, where almost all the students that come to us are singularly focused on the job they're going to get. These are often first-generation university students. They are like, I'm just going to be a nurse. They're not there for an exploratory, expansive, sort of degree in, sort of like, whatever they think is the most kind of decadent subject, like sort of poetry or whatever. They're like, I'm just going to be a nurse, and that's what I have to do, and this is costing me a fortune to do it. And so my colleague and I, after I've been teaching at this school for 17 years, and after about 7 years teaching at that, sort of we were so tired of these kind of lamentations about the neoliberal university and the sort of the obsession with the economics of it, and the lamentations over the death of the humanities and now the death of the sciences and the arts and sciences, and everybody's sort of moving toward professional studies. And we sort of said to ourselves, okay, what if we could interrupt that nurse briefly on her path, because it doesn't feel just to say to her, listen, everything is in crisis, the planet is on fire, and we don't even know if nursing is going to exist in 5 years, so you need to totally rethink your entire life. If I say that to the 18-year-old that wants to be a nurse, she's in a panic, she's in a meltdown, I'm not going to get anything, nothing productive is going to happen. But yet, here I am with this curriculum where I want to say, like, we are facing the wickedest problems that we've ever faced as a global society. I don't think wicked problems are new, but the scale of them is unlike anything humans have ever seen before. And so we need to change everything, and it needs to happen immediately. Well, whenever I hear so many people saying that, I just think it's not going to happen, so let's just go to bed. Because how do we change people immediately? But then I think, okay, so maybe I can sort of just find a little bit of an opportunity for that nurse on her path to just bring her over into this classroom that's a little bit different, that feels safe, and give her this one opportunity to be exposed to a whole different kind of set of ways of thinking connected to social and environmental justice, that can expand her world, and that can maybe make her the kind of person who would want to grant equal political access to people, who would want to think about the moral standing of individuals, who would want to pay more taxes. Right? That's the soil we need. We need to make more people who want these things, who desire these things. And again, not because we tell them they should, not because we tell them they're assholes if they don't, but because they want it. We show them that there's a better world on the other side of them paying more taxes, which even in itself, I think taxes is a terrible term. We need a new brand for taxes, right? It should be like, it should be a word that says, like, I want to pay more to take care of and encourage the flourishing of my global community. I don't know, that's too long. But, yeah. There's so much resonant in that word taxes because it's like what you should do. And it's no wonder that if that's how we approach it, we don't end up with enough people who are excited about what we could do if we paid more taxes. So we created this course, and it's an interdisciplinary course. We pick a theme, and we pick a theme that is like where the students don't know what they're going to get. So dirt, Trojans. Last year was chaos. This year was dreams. Next year is play. Something where the students are like, okay, I guess I'll take a course on dirt. Like, what is that going to be? And that sort of pulls them in. The actual title of the course is Introduction to Interdisciplinary Analysis, but if we called it that, no one would take it. So we call it something sexy. And then that nurse is like, well, I guess maybe I'll take dirt for like a little dabbling in dirt on my way to on my path. And then when we get them in the classroom, then we can sort of try and like open their minds up to all these other things. But again, I think the duty, the responsibility we have as university educators is to turn them on to a better world. And to open their minds to these possibilities, and not to frame it as an ought and an obligation, but an opportunity for something better.
Thank you. I'm kind of looking at you and thinking that you have your wheels turning and you want to comment.
Yes, I want to hear what the other philosopher says.
Well, I would like to comment, but isn't that unfair towards the other two who haven't had a chance to? See, I'm a philosopher, very concerned about fairness here.
Yes. Do you have 30-second comment, or should I go to them and then back to you?
I think you should first go to them, and then you can come back to me.
the philosopher has spoken.
Yeah, so the economists will speak.
Not that the economists
Nigeria was mentioned. Nigeria is an oil-rich country in Africa, but it's one of the most inegalitarian countries in the world. Its poverty is rampant. Norway is an oil-rich country, one of the most egalitarian countries in the world, and with a steady economic growth. So what's the difference between Norway and Nigeria? And the answer is institutions. You know, in Nigeria, oil has created a resource curse. In Norway, resources have been a blessing for the country. So clearly, if I'm going to say, you know, what is the key to development and a good society, it's about institutions. We know corruption, favoritism, that's killing long-term development. It's a recipe for inequality, unfair inequality. But how do you address that? How do you make Nigeria a more just society? How do you create good institutions? I don't know, and I'll leave that to. That's unfair, but I'll leave that to Lise. The economy. There's been a revolution in economics. It's called the experimental revolution. It's about not being overwhelmed by these big questions, which are very, very hard to address, but taking one problem at a time, but really important problems. Education, for instance. We mentioned, how do we improve education in Africa? There's an educational crisis. And we've been talking a lot about education. And there's so many dimensions of this. You have to have good quality teachers. The teachers have to know their stuff. They have to show up to school. They have to have the right kind of pedagogy, to not teaching, imagining that the students are going to be, university students or belong to the elite, that, just talking to the students at the level teaching to the right level, that's the one thing, the classrooms are crowded with students, maybe we need more teachers. We don't really know, and with limited resources, how can we really improve education at the lowest cost, basically? And these are questions which are being addressed by economists following this experimental philosophy, which really is about evidence-based policies, the randomized control trials, where you experiment. You offer to some schools incentives for teachers to show up. You see, okay, what is the effect of splitting up classes to not having 100 kids in the classroom, but maybe 20 kids in the classroom. So which of these policies actually is most effective in creating learning, if that's what we care about? So, and piece by piece, we create evidence on what works and what doesn't work and why. And we can use that to solve real problems. So, and I've been doing some of that in Tanzania, I've been doing that in Uganda. It's not time to talk about that. I talked about that in the course on experimental economics in developing countries. But that's I think, governments are looking for evidence-based policies, and at least we can offer causal evidence of what works and what doesn't, not to solve the inequality as such, but part of it, an important part of it. Thank you.
Lise.
So, he gave
one
me,
moment.
passed the ball to me.
One moment, Lise.
It's true.
Lise.
Okay, Kjetil and I, we agree fundamentally.
Lise, sorry. I want you to actually, as you go in and take the ball from him, that you also consider the historical dimension of it. There was a question about it. This historical dimension that has created and perpetuated inequality. And there was a comment here on a difference between Norway and Nigeria is also that one never has been colonized, which is not exactly true. Norway has been colonized as well, even though sometimes they don't admit it. But I think we are talking about another dimension of colonization. And I know you can also talk to that within your talk and the ball. So it's the bigger ball.
I just felt like you gave me 6 topics, and I don't think you extended my time. So this is going to be very, very interesting. First of all, everyone who's spent some time in Norwegian schools know that in Norwegian history books, there is a time period that's called 400 years of darkness. And those were the 400 years that we were colonized. And we call it by Denmark and Sweden, and we call them the Age of Darkness. So that's, so we do have a bit of a colonial history, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, institutions. I cannot agree more with you. The strong institutions is what's needed, and that's where we go. So I'm going to have 3 because you asked us for suggestions how to address inequality. So I have like 3 at 3 levels, and I'm going to try to be quick. So, and I'm sort of following up from you. So number 1, it's not only that we need better, we need global governance. We need global governance that addresses these inequalities, both the historical inequalities, but also, you know, the global institutions we have today are supremely weak, and to the extent that they work for the powerful. They work for, and so we need to address this issue of lack of and poor global governance. And in a very simple term, what we need, and I've said it before, I'm going to say it many more times, what we need is global social democracy. And I mean, that is the one thing that could change this inequality on a global scale. Point number 1, the big issue. How do we get global social democracy? Second issue, I think, and this is a response to the Nigeria question coming up, the historical data is relatively clear. From democracies work better than autocracies in terms of addressing inequalities. Why is that? It's the long historical data tells us that, if I can use a bad word, maybe not, democracies don't screw up so much. Democracies, okay, they don't work like perfectly, not at all, but autocracies through history, they have really bad periods, really bad famines, really, you know, they muck it up. And so that is the big difference, historically speaking, on the long trajectory between democracies and autocracies, which is why democracies is what we should aim for. Do they work? No. And they don't work good enough to address inequalities. Protest, the vote, information, all this is important. But it is the case that one of my favorite social scientists wrote in 1966, and it hasn't changed. The problem in the pluralist heaven is that it sings with a very distinct upper class accent. So the institutions work for the rich, and that is the huge issue to address. Everyone has mentioned taxation, that's my last word. In our course, we actually had 2 days, 2 whole days to talk about taxation. I think a lot of the students going in were a little bit concerned, like a course on inequality and governance, 2 days on taxation. I think those were, like, I think this is when when we really had the deep discussions on inequality, democracy, and governance. And I think, to be honest, we should have a whole course on just taxation. But I think one key insight is that this is the key institution for addressing inequality. But you have to tax smart. So many countries now in the global south, especially in Africa, are, you know, governments are under so much pressure to tax and to increase the tax revenue that people are dropping out of the tax net. People like small businesses running their businesses on mobile phones, they're getting taxed so much that they are, you know, they're leaving the economy. They're going into the informal economy. Meanwhile, the big bucks are still in Cayman Island. So the problem is, it's not only to tax, but you have to tax equally and fairly and smartly. That's my final word. Thank you.
So we have 1 minute to go.
You said you could have 30 seconds, so you're fine.
You have 30 seconds, but I want to give the opportunity also to 1 second questions. No, if someone has really burning questions, to also have the opportunity. And Haldis, can you sort of see who wants to ask questions while we?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to address the question from the audience online about colonialism, and I think this is a really important topic, and I think it's an important topic precisely for the reasons that Lisa was talking about. Institutions in many states in former colonies are not actually supported by the population, and I think if we're thinking about economic measures, more and more we need to come up with a formula how we can compensate people for the harm of colonization, right? More and more economists are thinking about this, so whether or not we should think about compensating people for the kind of loss of resource gains, or whether or not we can compensate people for the loss of political stability. I mean, obviously there are cultural harms that we can't really compensate for, we can only apologize for. And then there are social harms that we can hope to ameliorate, but we can't really compensate for. The only thing that we can really compensate for is the economic harms. And I think, you know, I haven't talked about taxes. Of course, I'm happy to talk about taxes, but I don't know anything about it, so I would rather not. I do think that we need to, and this goes probably back to this kind of education model, we need to realize that the time where we can pilfer countries for our own benefits, including environmentally, is over, right? Because that time is staring us in the face, either because people are engaged in wars, civil wars, territorial wars, religious wars, or because of the climate change that we are facing ourselves, right? So I think in that respect, taxation may be a good thing. How we sell it to people, I have no idea. But I think that colonization is still, in 2022, such an urgent topic that we haven't talked about when we talk about equality globally, right?
And very, very quickly, I would just say that I think that we also need to be very careful that with sort of climate crisis, that we don't sign on to sort of these broad unilateral solutions that I think are vulnerable to enacting similar colonial structures of we don't have time for difference, we don't have time for different local responses to climate change, things are too urgent, we need a global unilateral solution that we will impose on everybody because the crisis is too urgent, and we know who is going to write that plan.
Yeah. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Kari Egerstedt. I'm the head of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Bergen. I have been co-teaching a course with Renee, and I think you actually came to the point that I was somewhat missing in this discussion, so I just wanted to point it out, and that is the question of who are the we, because we've been hearing a lot of we need to do this and we need to do that, and not so much thinking about who is this we. And I just wanted to kind of like remind, just to hang on to my favorite theorist, Kjetil Bjorvatn, talk about like rot education and apartheid of education, and the whole kind of like thinking about human rights, as many has pointed out, and Hannah Arendt, for example, the whole concept of human rights have a tendency to divide up the population of those who have rights and those who doesn't have rights, and then it becomes the obligation or the privilege of those who doesn't have rights to give other people rights. And of course, in that's a certain kind of inequality itself. And what Kjetil Bjorvatn is doing when she's doing her teaching education programs is kind of just to be able to teach. So you have to have a really minimum level of abstract understanding to know what a right is. And in order to have that, to claim your right. So who can claim rights, and what kind of language is it claiming rights into? So that's kind of like linking up the education, the we, the human rights part, and maybe sometimes I feel like, what can we do? For myself, sometimes I feel I just have to step back and see how many more voices we can get. So I just wanted to point to that.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other comments or questions? We really need to wrap it up, but I think it has been a really interesting discussion. I certainly felt so, and I think that our audience, we had a very engaged audience online, really from minute one, asking questions. Do you have one last comment before we close down? No?
I have a comment about the we.
The we. Yes.
I think the we is all of us, right? And this is exactly the difference, right? The we includes people in the global south, people who are fighting for the democratic rights in Hong Kong, people who are asking for educational rights for women, et cetera, right? I mean, this is exactly the change now. We can't retreat to a kind of age of innocence where we say, oh, well, we don't know what's happening in those other countries, right? So the we is the global we.
Yes.
Maybe it's Ubuntu. It's like the Cartesian, Descartes is like, I think, therefore I am, right? Mm-hmm. But the Ubuntu part is that I am because we are. So that is kind of, and that is really necessary in education. That's also, so I thank you for the comment, and that was also what I tried to stress, but not so eloquently that you did. This necessity of scrutinize the knowledge that we need, that are different around the place. There's not one universal fix. They are all sort of different configured in different places based on colonial history, based on coloniality. It's there, absolutely. So it's so this kind of the accept for the pluriverse of knowledge that we are. Yes.
Including non-humans.
Non-human animals.
Non-human animals. But also non-animals, plants as well.
I think we need a we that has space for otherness. I would just say that. Absolutely, yes.
And in usness.
And usness. I like that.
Yeah. And with that, I thank you, the audience online and the audience here present. I would stay here for hours on end because I don't think we have closed this discussion. It's a process, but the process can also be beautiful. And thank you for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.